Ma'am, put the bag down and turn around. I saw you tuck that scarf into your sleeve.
Officer, please, I am only looking for a gift. It is for my Samantha. I have not left the store.
I don't care who it's for. You concealed it. That's theft.
No, sir. I was going to the front. I need my hands free for my cane.
Turn around. Now.
Samantha,
Turn around.
I was going to pay.
Officer Matt Griffin, 42 years old, a lateral hire 7 months into his placement at the Meridian City Police Department, walked into the Willow Tree Boutique on a Tuesday afternoon, saw an elderly black woman with a silk scarf draped over her forearm, and arrived at a conclusion before he reached her. He had no call from management, no confirmed complaint, no signal of criminal intent from the woman herself, not a rush toward the exit, not a concealed departure, not a single movement suggesting flight. Just an elderly woman, a silk scarf, a cane, and a story he had already decided was true. He approached her not with a question, but with an accusation. When she tried to explain herself, he dismissed her. When the store manager stepped forward to intervene, a man who knew her by name, who had watched her shop there for years, Griffin cut him off before he could finish a sentence. When Amaka became distressed, repeating her daughter's name like a lifeline she was afraid of losing, Griffin read her confusion as defiance. And when her frail, trembling body could not comply with commands she did not fully understand, he spun her around, placed her hands behind her back, and closed a pair of metal handcuffs around the paper-thin wrists of an 80-year-old woman with dementia. What Officer Matt Griffin did not know, what he had not bothered to ask, to investigate, or to consider for even one of the 5 seconds it took him to make his decision, was that the woman he just placed in restraints, in front of a boutique full of witnesses and a security camera that captured every frame, that was the mother of Samantha Phillips, the sitting district attorney of Meridian City, whose name appeared on the letterhead of every single arrest report Griffin had ever filed. His decision to treat a grandmother with dementia like a shoplifter over a teal silk scarf she intended to purchase would cost him his badge, his peace officer certification, his place in any law enforcement agency in the country, and the city of Meridian $3.8 million. Before we go further, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments. We love knowing who's in the room with us, and if you believe an 80-year-old woman with dementia deserves dignity, not handcuffs, like this video and subscribe. A Tuesday afternoon at the Willow Tree Boutique sounds exactly the way a place should sound when nothing is wrong. The soft drift of instrumental music from speakers tucked near the ceiling. The rustle of tissue paper as a sales associate wraps a purchase in the back. The low, unhurried murmur of a handful of customers moving through racks of fabric and glass display cases, taking their time because nothing requires them to hurry. And near the center of the floor, beside the accessories display, where the scarves were folded in careful rows by color, stood Amaka, 80 years old. A cane in her left hand, its rubber tip worn smooth from years of faithful use. A pair of reading glasses she had pushed to the top of her head and forgotten about. Moving through the boutique the way she moved through most things in her life, slowly, deliberately, with a particular kind of attention that belonged to women who had learned long ago that the details were what mattered. She had been standing at that display for nearly 10 minutes, lifting scarves one by one, holding them briefly toward the light, setting them back down. She was not browsing. She was deciding. There was a difference. Ketsia, the boutique manager, had greeted Amaka the moment she walked through the door, the way she always did, the way you greet someone who has been coming to your store long enough that their arrival feels like a return rather than a visit. She knew Amaka's name. She knew Amaka's daughter's name. She had gift-wrapped purchases for Samantha's birthday twice before, and knew that Amaka always paid in cash, always thanked her twice, and always paused at the door on her way out to say something kind about the music. Kezia had noticed in recent months that Amaka sometimes needed a little more time, a little more patience, a little gentle guidance back to the item she had been reaching for before her attention drifted. She had never once found this to be a burden. Amaka had not always moved this slowly. There had been a version of her, a version that still lived, vivid and insistent, in the memories of her children, who had moved through the world at a pace that made exhaustion look like a choice other people made. She had arrived in the United States in 1970, at 17 years old, carrying almost nothing. What she carried instead what she had refused to put down even when the weight of it might have broken someone else, was the name her mother had given her. The values her father had spoken into her before the war swallowed him, and a conviction, absolute and unshakable, that dignity was not something the world owed you. It was something you kept, through everything, no matter the cost. She had kept it through 3 jobs and 2 decades of sacrifice. She had kept it through raising children in a country that did not always see her. She had kept it long enough to watch her daughter, Samantha, take an oath in a courtroom and become the highest-ranking legal officer in the city. She had come to the Willow Tree Boutique on this particular Tuesday to find a birthday gift worthy of that daughter. She had spotted the teal silk scarf, the color of deep ocean water, the color of crossing, and lifted it from the table. And because her hands were occupied, because the cane demanded one and the scarf demanded the other, she had draped it over her forearm and tucked it gently beneath her coat sleeve to keep it safe while she made her way to the register. That was the moment Officer Matt Griffin walked through the door. Griffin did not look at Amaka's cane when he approached. That was the first tell. He moved toward her with the velocity of a man who has already completed his investigation in his own mind and is now simply executing its conclusion. He did not scan the room. He did not speak to the manager standing 10 feet away. He did not look at the register she was slowly orienting herself toward, or the reading glasses she had forgotten on her head, or the way her lips were moving almost imperceptibly as she repeated the same name to herself. Samantha. Samantha, the way people repeat a word when they are afraid of losing it. He looked at the slight bulge beneath her coat sleeve and saw, in full, everything he needed. This is a pattern that researchers in both cognitive psychology and law enforcement bias literature have documented in detail. It is called belief perseverance, the tendency to interpret all subsequent information as confirmation of a conclusion already reached, rather than as independent evidence to be evaluated. By the time Griffin opened his mouth, he was not investigating a possible shoplifting. He was narrating one. Every trembling movement Amaka made became proof of guilt. Every confused word became evasion. Every plea became an excuse. The store manager's attempt to intervene became an obstacle. The cane, the age, the repeated name. As the coat pulled on over clothes not quite suited to the weather, none of it registered as context. All of it was filtered out. Because the image in front of him, an elderly black woman, a boutique, a sleeve with something underneath, had already resolved itself, in his mind, into something that required not his questions, but his authority. To understand how that 5-second decision was made, and why it was almost inevitable given the officer standing in that boutique on that afternoon, you have to go back, not just to Amaka's Tuesday, but to the woman she had spent 80 years becoming, and the long, unbroken thread of survival that made what happened next so much more than a misunderstanding. Samantha Phillips, 52 years old, Beth had spent the better part of 2 decades learning how to read a case file the way a surgeon reads a scan, not for what was visible on the surface, but for what the surface was hiding. As the sitting district attorney of Meridian City, she oversaw every prosecution that moved through the county's criminal courts, every charging decision, every plea negotiation, every case that required the full consequential weight of the law to be applied to a human life. She had built that career on a single, non-negotiable principle that her mother had given her before she gave her anything else, that an upright name was the only currency that never devalued. She carried that principle into every courtroom, every press conference, every difficult decision made in a quiet office at 7 in the morning when no one was watching. She was in that office now. Case files arranged in the particular order she preferred, organized not by date but by exposure, the ones requiring the most careful attention positioned closest to her right hand. She was reviewing arrest reports, signing charging documents, moving with the efficiency of a woman who understood that delay in this office had consequences that rippled outward into people's lives in ways they rarely recovered from. Griffin's name had appeared on several of the files that crossed her desk in recent months. She had noticed his paperwork the way you notice a recurring word in a document, not with alarm, but with the quiet, cataloged awareness that her training had made automatic. She had seen his name, she had processed it, she had moved on. Her assistant's voice came through the intercom with the particular flatness people use when they are trying to hold something steady. "There's been an incident involving your mother." Samantha did not move immediately. She set down her pen. She breathed, one slow, deliberate breath, the kind she had learned to use in courtrooms when the news was bad and the room was watching. Then she stood up. Back at the Willow Tree Boutique, the situation had passed the point of confusion and arrived somewhere far more serious. Amaka was no longer repeating Samantha's name. She was speaking in Igbo, calling out for her mother, her father, people who had been gone for more than 50 years. Her voice was small and frightened, the voice of a child displaced inside an old woman's body, reaching for the only anchors her fractured memory could still locate. This is a phenomenon clinicians call sundowning, a well-documented symptom of dementia in which cognitive function deteriorates sharply in the afternoon and early evening hours, particularly under conditions of stress. When a dementia patient is frightened, when their environment becomes hostile or unpredictable, the brain does not respond by sharpening. It retreats. It reaches backward. The confusion is not performance. The distress is not strategy. It is neurological, involuntary, and, to anyone with even a basic understanding of the condition, unmistakable. Griffin did not have that understanding, or if he did, he chose not to apply it. He registered Amaka's escalating distress as non-compliance and responded by tightening the cuffs. What he failed to consider, what he had never paused long enough to evaluate, was a foundational principle of criminal law that first-year law students encounter in their opening weeks: mens rea. The term comes from the Latin for guilty mind, and it refers to the mental state required for an act to constitute a crime. For shoplifting to be a criminal offense, the prosecution must establish that the accused intended to permanently deprive the owner of their property. Intent is not incidental to the charge, it is the charge. And a person in the advanced stages of dementia, a person whose brain is no longer reliably generating the capacity for deliberate, forward-thinking decision-making, may be legally incapable of forming that intent. Without intent, there is no crime. Without a crime, there is no lawful arrest. There is only an unlawful seizure, dressed in the language of authority. Griffin had never asked himself that question. He had never been required to, because he had never slowed down long enough to ask any question at all. The boutique doors opened. Samantha Phillips walked in without raising her voice. She took in the scene in the span of a single breath, her mother's restrained wrists, the red marks already forming against paper-thin skin, the fear in Amaka's eyes that had not been there when she left the house that morning. The security camera in the upper corner of the room recorded everything. Griffin turned. The recognition was not slow. It arrived all at once, and it took the color with it. "Officer, remove the handcuffs, now." "Ma'am, she concealed merchandise. You are currently detaining an 80-year-old dementia patient without probable cause, and every second you delay compounds your liability." The boutique went silent. Griffin removed the cuffs. Samantha called for an ambulance, and then she knelt beside her mother and held her, and spoke to her softly in Igbo, the language of home, the language of safety, while the officer who had put her there stood behind them, understanding for the first time exactly what he had done. The hospital evaluation documented 3 things with clinical precision: bruised wrists consistent with the application of restraints, acute psychological distress, and, perhaps most significantly, measurable cognitive regression that the attending physician attributed directly to the trauma of the incident. This last finding mattered in ways that extended far beyond the medical chart. Dementia does not respond to distress the way a healthy brain does. You see, it does not recover, reset, and return to baseline once the threat has passed. Traumatic episodes in dementia patients can accelerate the disease's progression, collapsing months of stability in a single afternoon. What Griffin had done in 5 seconds had consequences that would outlast any settlement, any policy, any press conference. Amaka came home from that hospital a little further away than she had been when she left it. Samantha understood this. She also understood something else, that the most dangerous thing she could do, for her mother's case and for her own integrity, was to remain in any position of prosecutorial authority over the officer responsible. She recused herself formally and completely, filing the documentation herself the same day. It was the kind of move that required no deliberation, because it was not a difficult decision, it was the only decision. A civil suit was filed shortly after, and the machinery of accountability, slow, imperfect, but in this instance grinding forward, began to move. The internal affairs review that followed was built largely on a foundation of footage. The boutique's security camera had captured the encounter in full, and Griffin's body camera had been active throughout. What the footage showed was not ambiguous. It showed the store manager, Kezia, moving toward Griffin within the first 90 seconds, attempting to intervene, to provide context, to identify Amaka by name. It showed Griffin raising a hand and cutting her off with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to deciding whose information was relevant before he had heard it. It showed no attempt to verify intent. No assessment of capacity, no de-escalation technique of any kind. It showed a conclusion being enforced, not an investigation being conducted. What the footage could not show, but what the discovery process uncovered, was what Griffin had brought into that boutique long before he walked through the door. His personnel file, obtained through the civil litigation, contained a notation that a more thorough vetting process would have treated as disqualifying. Excessive force complaint, resolved. That word, resolved, was doing a great deal of quiet work. It did not mean exonerated. It did not mean the complaint was unfounded. It meant the previous department had settled, privately, without fanfare, charged without any formal finding on the record, and transferred the liability to a file that would not follow Griffin into his next application unless someone looked carefully enough to find it. This is what researchers and civil rights attorneys have come to call the gypsy cop problem. The term describes officers who accumulate misconduct in one department, avoid decertification through quiet administrative resolution, and then transfer their record and their behavior to a new jurisdiction that has not been fully informed of what it is receiving. The previous complaint against Griffin had involved excessive force against an elderly man during a welfare check. The pattern was not hidden. It was simply not shared. And Meridian City, in its eagerness to fill a vacancy with an experienced lateral hire, had not looked hard enough to find it. That failure of institutional diligence would become a central pillar of the civil case, not just Griffin's conduct, but the city's responsibility for placing him in a position to repeat it. The psychological dimension of Griffin's behavior, examined during depositions, pointed to something that law enforcement training researchers have documented extensively: the danger of pattern recognition operating without critical override. Griffin had been trained to identify concealment as a precursor to theft. That training, applied without context, had caused him to see the contours of a crime in the silhouette of a confused woman trying to keep a scarf safe while managing a cane. Every subsequent piece of information, the cane itself, the trembling hands, Kezia's attempted intervention, Amaka's evident distress, was processed not as new evidence, but as noise to be filtered out. Psychologists call this belief perseverance, and in a law enforcement context, its consequences can be catastrophic. When Griffin testified, he said it plainly. She hid it. That's probable cause. But concealment inside a store by a customer who had not approached an exit, who was still browsing, who had a manager present and willing to speak on her behalf, does not constitute probable cause for arrest. Probable cause requires facts, not assumptions. It requires an investigation, not an interruption. It requires the officer to ask the question before delivering the verdict. He had never asked the question. By the time the city's own attorneys completed their exposure assessment, the document on the table carried a single, unambiguous designation in the risk column. It read, high. The deposition room has a particular quality of silence that courtrooms do not. Courtrooms carry the ambient tension of an audience, the weight of performance, the awareness of gallery eyes. A deposition room is smaller than that. It is just a table, a recorder, and the truth with nowhere to go. Samantha Phillips was not present in the room as a daughter. She had recused herself from any prosecutorial role, and she sat where she sat not to emote, but to observe, with the stillness of someone who had spent 18 years watching people reveal themselves under the pressure of a question they could not answer their way out of. The attorney retained by the civil plaintiff worked through the examination the way a skilled surgeon works, not with force, but with precision. The questions were not complicated. That was the point. Did you ask Mrs. Amaka whether she intended to purchase the scarf? No. Did you confirm her identity or situation with the store manager before making physical contact? No. Were you aware at the time of the arrest that Mrs. Amaka had been diagnosed with dementia? No. Did you conduct any assessment of her cognitive capacity before placing her in restraints? No. Each answer was a single syllable. Each syllable landed in the record like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples moved outward in every direction. What the sequence of responses revealed was not just a series of procedural failures. It was the complete absence of an investigation. Griffin had not skipped steps. There were no steps. There was only a conclusion, and then an arrest, with nothing of legal substance in between. This is where the Fourth Amendment becomes not an abstraction, but an accounting. The Fourth Amendment to the United States Constitution protects citizens against unreasonable searches and seizures. An arrest is a seizure, one of the most consequential the state can impose on a private individual. For a seizure to be lawful, it must be supported by probable cause, a reasonable belief grounded in articulable facts that a crime has been or is being committed. Probable cause is not a feeling. It is not a visual impression. It is not the officer's intuition hardened into certainty. It requires facts that have been observed, intent that has been reasonably inferred from those facts, and, critically, an investigation sufficient to distinguish between what appears to be happening and what is actually happening. Griffin had none of these things. He had an assumption. And an assumption, no matter how confidently held, has never been sufficient legal justification for placing a human being in restraints. The city's legal team had understood their exposure long before the deposition concluded. What they were now doing was quantifying it. The calculus was not emotional. It was arithmetic, applied to a set of compounding liabilities that had accumulated with the mechanical indifference of interest on a debt. There was the Fourth Amendment violation, unlawful seizure without probable cause, documented on camera, confirmed by testimony. There was the emotional trauma sustained by a dementia patient who had spent the hours following her arrest in a state of acute psychological distress, calling for people who had been dead for 50 years. There were the medical costs, including the hospitalization and the clinical assessment of accelerated cognitive regression. There was the city's institutional failure, its inadequate vetting of a lateral hire whose previous misconduct had been resolved quietly rather than addressed formally, a failure that made the city not merely a bystander to Griffin's conduct, but a contributing cause of it. And then there was the figure that city attorneys are most careful about, punitive exposure in the event of a jury trial. Juries, presented with footage of an 80-year-old dementia patient being handcuffed over a scarf she intended to purchase, do not tend toward restraint in their awards. The risk of sending this case to 12 civilians was not a risk the city's legal team was willing to absorb. The settlement figure that emerged from those calculations was $3.8 million. It was not a gesture of remorse. It was the arithmetic answer to a problem the city had created, priced at the precise point where absorbing the cost became more rational than contesting it. The administrative consequences moved on a separate but parallel track. The State Peace Officer Review Board, presented with the body camera footage, the deposition record, the prior excessive force complaint, and the circumstances of Griffin's lateral transfer, did not deliberate at length. His peace officer certification was revoked. His name was entered into the National Decertification Database, a registry designed specifically to close the gap that gypsy cops exploit, ensuring that a quiet resolution in one jurisdiction cannot become a fresh start in another. There would be no lateral transfer, no new precinct, no next incident. The door that had allowed him to move a problem sideways had been closed, and this time, it was locked. 3 days after the settlement was finalized, the city announced a press conference. The footage spread the way footage does when it contains something the public recognizes before it can articulate what it is seeing. Within 48 hours of the press conference, the security camera clip from the Willow Tree Boutique had been viewed millions of times. What people watched was not complicated. An elderly woman with a cane, a silk scarf, and a look of absolute bewilderment on her face, being turned around and restrained by an officer who never once paused to ask a question. The comments, the shares, the segments on evening broadcasts, none of them were about shoplifting. The conversation had already moved with the swift collective instinct of a public that understood what it had witnessed. This was not a retail crime story. This was a story about what happens when the people entrusted with public safety are not equipped to recognize the difference between a criminal and a confused grandmother, and about what that failure costs, in dollars, in dignity, and in the irreversible erosion of a family's ordinary Tuesday. What followed in the policy space was direct, and it was named without ambiguity. The city's new directive was entered into the municipal code under the formal designation of the Amaka Safeguard, a title that the city council did not debate because there was nothing to debate. The policy carried 4 provisions, each one a specific answer to a specific failure the incident had exposed. First, all active duty officers were required to complete mandatory training in dementia recognition and neurodivergence awareness, not as a one-time orientation module, but as a recertified, annually renewed competency. The research supporting this requirement is substantial. Studies in law enforcement and geriatric medicine consistently show that officers without dementia-specific training misread the behavioral symptoms of cognitive impairment, the repetition, the confusion, the apparent non-compliance, as indicators of intoxication, deception, or resistance. The training does not ask officers to become clinicians. It asks them to slow down long enough to consider an alternative explanation before they act on the first one. Second, no officer was permitted to arrest any citizen over the age of 75 without a supervising officer present at the scene. This provision alone would have prevented everything that happened in that boutique. Third, annual de-escalation certification was made mandatory, closing the gap between training received at the academy and judgment exercised on the street years later. Fourth, and perhaps most structurally significant, the city implemented a centralized lateral hire screening protocol, a requirement that all transfer candidates be run through the National Decertification Database and that any prior complaint, regardless of how it had been resolved, be disclosed and reviewed before an offer was extended. The Gypsy Cop pipeline runs on institutional silence. The Amaka Safeguard required the city to speak. Samantha Phillips used a portion of the settlement to build something. Not a monument, not a memorial, but a place, a working, functional, living resource center on the east side of the city, in the neighborhood where her mother had spent the better part of 30 years. She named it the Amaka Refugee and Elder Center, and it opened 14 months after the incident with a full roster of services, legal navigation assistance for immigrant seniors moving through a system that was not designed with them in mind, healthcare guidance offered in multiple languages, cultural advocacy for families whose traditions and histories were routinely made invisible by institutions that did not know how to see them, and dementia education workshops available to family caregivers, community members, and, by formal partnership agreement, to the Meridian City Police Department itself. The center did not emerge from grief. It emerged from the same principle Amaka had carried across an ocean at 17 years old, that when a system fails you, you do not wait for it to repair itself. You build what it should have been. Amaka attended the opening. She wore a teal silk scarf, soft, the color of deep ocean water, the color of crossing. It was the same scarf. She had gone back to the Willow Tree Boutique and purchased it properly, with Samantha beside her and Kezia behind the counter. The receipt had been framed and now hung on the wall of the center's entrance, just inside the door, where everyone who walked in would see it. On the afternoon of the opening, after the speeches and the photographs and the quiet, sustained applause of a room full of people who understood exactly what they were celebrating, Amaka sat by the window in the center's main gathering room. The light came in at the angle it always does in the late afternoon, warm and long and unhurried. She was speaking softly in Igbo. Samantha sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, listening to words she did not always understand but had spent a lifetime learning to receive. She had survived a war. She had survived displacement. She had survived the particular violence of being seen as something lesser than what she was. And this time, for the first time in a long chain of indignities that stretched back further than one Tuesday afternoon in one boutique in one city, the system had not simply moved on. It had been required to change. It took 5 seconds to close a pair of handcuffs. It took $3.8 million to open the city's eyes. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you. Genuinely. That means something. The greatest lesson in Amaka's story is not about one bad officer. It is about what happens when institutions stop asking questions, when they hire without checking, act without investigating, and move problems sideways instead of solving them. Amaka paid the price for every one of those failures, and she should not have had to. If this story moved you, if it taught you something, if it made you think about someone you love, share it. Send it to a friend. Recommend it to a family member with an elderly parent. Subscribe if you haven't already, because this is exactly the kind of story we tell on this channel. Real, detailed, and built to make you think. We have another video dropping tomorrow, and you do not want to miss it. And while you're here, the video on your screen right now. Watch that next. You'll thank yourself later.